Is everybody ready?
Okay.
Sam and I negate resolve, committing U.S. ground combat troops to fight ISIL is in the best interest of the United States. Contention 1, escalating the violence. U.S. ground troops exacerbates the violence in 3 ways. First, it feeds into ISIL's propaganda machine. Clarion Project's Ryan Maurer explains, it is clear from pro-Islamic State social media that the group wants to face American troops on the ground. Pictures and videos of American military casualties are invaluable propaganda to help maintain a sense of success. Second, it shifts ISIL's tactics. According to Patrick Coburn in his book ISIS: Rise of Islamic State, when faced with mass attacks, ISIL shifted its tactics to more guerrilla, anti-civilian killings. Such a shift explains why Reed Wood of Arizona State finds empirically that a 1 standard deviation increase in ground troops increases civilian killings by 25%. Third, it transnationalizes the violence. Were the U.S. to intervene, it would change ISIL's targets of attacks from being purely Iraqi to focusing on America as well. That's why Eric Neumeyer of the London School of Economics finds a 1 standard deviation increase in military support increases anti-American terrorism by 24%, and why Matthew Powers of the University of Illinois finds, quote, if the intervening power decides to use ground forces, the percentage increase in terrorism ranges from 5.8% to 20.6% for small-scale interventions. Contention 2, the legitimacy gap. This is 4 aspects. First, Scott Moore of GMU writes, to be successful, counterinsurgencies must be perceived as legitimate. Unfortunately, as Rand's David Gompert writes, thanks to past intervention in Iraq, U.S. military forces are presumptively illegitimate. Because Muslim antipathy to Western military intervention is so deep and wide, the challenge of attaining popular legitimacy for the direct use of physical force by the U.S. is insurmountable. New Chicago's Robert Pape writes, given the magnitude of U.S. military power, even modest steps up the Shia against the Sunnis would serve as a catalyst for Sunni resistance, and therefore we would again be seen as foreign occupiers. This perception of occupation is devastating for American counterinsurgency. Pape writes, more than 95% of all suicide attacks are in response to foreign occupation. Perhaps most significantly, an empirical analysis of 286 insurgencies by Yale's Jason Lyle found that being perceived as an occupying force reduces the likelihood of a successful counterinsurgency by 59%. Second, it legitimizes ISIL's violence. According to Michael Weiss in his book ISIS: Inside the Army of Terror, al-Qaeda in Iraq collapsed when it lost the legitimacy of the Iraqi Sunnis by targeting Iraqis. Indeed, as Patrick Coburn writes in his book The Rise of Islamic State, the future of ISIL depends on the acquiescence of Iraq's 5 million Sunnis. While anti-Muslim activity generates resentments, Rand's David Gompert writes, a majority of all Iraqis and nearly 9 in 10 Sunni Arabs consider the use of force against U.S. forces to be a legitimate form of resistance, meaning that the Sunnis are more likely to tolerate ISIL's insurgency they are facing off against Americans. Third, Maurer explains, the region reacts much more negatively to U.S. combat forces fighting in Iraqi towns than it does to airstrikes. In fact, he writes, U.S. ground troops could propel Arab partners to suspend involvement in military operations. This is problematic because, as Maurer explains, multilateralism is important for sharing the burden and undermining propaganda that the U.S. intervention is a war on Islam. Fourth, militia backlash. Currently, Shia popular mobilization forces are running around Iraq at will. These rogue militias are ruthless and, according to Time, have a history of massacring U.S. troops. Michael Prisoner of Liberation writes, Muqtada al-Sadr, a Shia militia commander, said that if U.S. ground troops were to come back to Iraq, their 500,000-strong force would start attacking them. While he likely overstates the true number of troops on the ground, the implications are clear. As Prisoner writes, U.S. troops would not just be embroiled in a ground war with the highly organized and well-funded Islamic State, but would again be fighting the same Iraqi militias that played a major role in forcing the U.S. military out of Iraq just 3 years ago. Bauer followed up, pointing out that 50,000-strong Kataib Hezbollah and Nasaib al-Haq have all issued similar threats about attacking U.S. troops were they to be deployed. The animosity is so deep that even the elected Iraqi government has said, we won't allow ground troops. Full stop.
Just before Show reads the case, can I see the last Bauer evidence you read?
Bauer about Kataib al-Hezbollah?
Yeah, that was
Yes. You ready?
Sure. Okay. And I mean, we're not going to... Yeah. Can you just show me this is...
It's highlighted.
So this is the full...
Yes, that's the full article.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
I know you can look at it during the speech, but if possible, could you hand it back as soon as possible?
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry, one more
That's
question.
whenever it's convenient.
Where's the 50,000?
Oh, it's a different card.
It's Daily Coast. Okay.
Oh, Daily Coast?
In
There we
the
go.
Mauro is not 50,000.
Sorry.
But he asked
Just
for Mauro.
the stuff about the other groups besides Monty Army.
So that's the one, yeah. Okay, and then this is the first one. That's this third. First one.
So this
Tide is
is
30.
and then the other one's 20.
this is Khatib's a small.
Yeah, we listed the two, the other one is Al Haq.
Okay, and then how do I get back tomorrow? Just again,
Yeah, that's it.
okay, and then get back to it. Okay, awesome. I'll read this first one then.
Yeah, and as soon as possible.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
So, at the leisure of my judges, my opponents,
Yeah.
Arvin, we affirm the resolution. Observation 1, neutralizing the threat. According to Newsweek just this month, ISIL has stated that the U.S. will burn in another 9/11 atrocity and warned that there is no safety for any American on the globe. This is horrifying as U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel notes that in terms of their capabilities, ISIL is beyond anything we have ever seen before. Further, Harvard explains the clear capacity for ISIL to acquire a weapon of mass destruction is unambiguous, furthering that before ISIL, the threat of a nuclear terrorist attack was already at 29%. Even worse, this month the FBI has declared as the numbers begin to grow, at some point our traditional investigative approach and capabilities will be outstripped. Consequently, the Senate Armed Service Committee finds ISIL to be a direct threat to our homeland, and we either confront them now or we will be forced to deal with an even stronger enemy in the future. In a calm world, no ground forces are used to neutralize this threat. As the pro, we offer 3 ways U.S. ground troops can fight ISIL, proving any one of which is in our best interest is sufficient for a pro ballot. Contention 1, taking out leaders. According to the Huffington Post, committing ground combat troops does not necessarily translate to conventional troops, but rather may mean small sets of special forces. According to the Mirror, one such group, Task Force Black, has been reactivated to target ISIL leaders. The Harvard Belfer Center finds that specific to insurgencies, the removal of leaders reduces conflict intensity, decreases attacks, and makes insurgency defeat 33% more likely. Additionally, the Council on Foreign Relations notes, quote, while aircrafts can kill people, only commandos can capture and interrogate high-level terrorists, gathering intel that has the potential to wipe out an entire enemy network. Contention 2, reducing displacement. According to Reuters, ISIL has displaced close to 2 million Iraqi civilians, tripling the refugee population. The persistence of refugees is dangerous, as Arkansas State University finds refugees are uniquely susceptible to radicalization as a result of apparent hopelessness and poor conditions. The Journal of International Affairs quantifies this with the 1% increase in a country's refugee population, increasing terrorist attacks by 18%. American forces reduce this threat in 2 ways. First, reclaiming cities allows civilians to return home. According to National Security Advisor Don Leon, quote, taking back territory requires an effective ground effort, and presently we don't have that. The McClatchy Washington Bureau furthers that based upon their present operations, forces in Iraq are terribly unprepared for the battle ahead, so much so that the operation to retake Mosul might need to be shelved indefinitely. Second, U.S. news reports that our failure to deploy combat troops has forced the Iraqi army to unwillingly rely on Iranian forces. An Israeli news source explains the right of return for refugees is not automatic. Any resident wishing to return must undergo an investigation by Iranian militiamen, which has prevented the Sunni population from returning home. To quote the refugees themselves, as long as the Iranians are there, I will not go back. If only the Americans had entered and liberated us. Contention 3, saving Afghanistan. According to The Independent, elements of ISIL are active in southern Afghanistan and are trying to spread north. The Institute for the Study of War furthers, in order to prevent ISIL from gaining a solid foothold in Afghanistan, the Afghan National Security Force will require robust assistance from the United States. The New York Times notes that, quote, the Intelligence Committee sees around 10,000 troops as a key baseline to keep counterterrorism operations going. Moreover, in response to the Afghan president's response to maintain U.S. troops in the country, Washington has decided to keep U.S. forces in the region so we can prevent the problem now rather than respond to an emergency as we did in Iraq. Afghanistan is key for 2 reasons. First, terrorist financing. Stanford reports that high estimates calculate ISIL at having at most $2 billion. However, Russian officials note that currently ISIL is making $1 billion from Afghan heroin, with potential profits of $50 billion if left unchecked. Second, recruitment. Iraq's National Security Advisor notes for ISIL, quote, when 100 jihadists enter a district, they would soon recruit between 5 and 10 times their original number. Afghani President Ghani furthers that stopping ISIL in Afghanistan is critical to breaking the organization, as he notes Afghanistan represents a strategic and religious foothold for the establishment of ISIL's caliphate. And for all these reasons, I urge a strong pro-ballot. Thank you.
I want to see Harvard, the new pair.
Are you ready for Crossfire?
Can I see Harvard new pair?
Which one? The first Belfer Center card about the capabilities or the one about the 29?
You just said the university.
You just said the university, so
Would
Everyone
everyone
about
vote?
ISIS wanting.
yeah,
Oh, okay, the WMD stuff.
yeah.
here, then, I mean, the conclusion is clear capacity to achieve it.
Okay, starting prep. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I have 10 seconds used there.
Is that right? So let's discuss Afghanistan. How many people have ISIL are in Afghanistan?
Well, the number is clearly not clear. We can't
Do you
give
have an
an
estimate? Like, do you have an estimate, like a range maybe?
Well, I mean, we can't be specific, but we know that they're there for sure, and we need to stop
okay,
them.
so it matters like whether there's 10 or 10,000. If we're
It
gonna be
really
committing
doesn't
10,000, wait, it does. If you're committing 10,000 troops, you have to be darn sure know what you're up against.
Okay, the Pentagon even confirmed that they're there, and we give two
Okay.
reasons why stopping there is important.
In
Can I
fact,
ask you a
wait.
question?
That they're there and there are lots of them are different statements. I want to
They
know
are there,
how.
and if we don't stop them now, their presence there will grow.
Okay, if
So
there's
we
one
need
of
to
them
stop
and it
them.
grows to 2, it's not worth
Clearly,
10,000 troops.
It's not one person. One person can't occupy the Zanzibar
Clearly,
province in the
It's
south.
occupying
Can
the
I ask you a
Zanzibar.
question?
Zanzibar's in Tanzania.
No, it's not. We
Yes, it is.
Like, the Zanzibar province is in the south.
Zanzibar. Okay.
Can I ask you a question now?
Yes.
Okay, so who is the leader of the Mahdi army?
Muqtada al-Sadr. He's from the Sadr
Who
city.
does he answer to?
He's pretty rogue
No, who does he answer to?
himself.
Why did he dissolve his force in 2008?
You were telling me.
That's because the Ayatollah Sistani told him to. The religious leader told him to.
So-
What did the Ayatollah say last month?
He says lots of things.
He
also
says-
he actually like tweeted something funny, but yeah.
He specifically says that we need to work with the United States forces and told the religious groups not to attack the
So-
United States.
Does that that applies to Muqtada al-Sadr
And
not
with the other groups as well.
wait, that he
All the
told it to
religious
those
groups.
two? Who said there are often a lot of like Shiite militias. They're not all
I mean-
answering to the Ayatollah.
I mean,
himself.
are these groups religious?
Some of them, yeah.
Some of them. Which ones aren't?
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's because they all are. And they all
Okay.
respond to the Ayatollah. So when the
Okay, so-
Ayatollah is specifically saying not to attack the United States, we're not going to see this happen when the United States goes in. Now,
Okay.
can I ask you another question?
No.
Okay, then.
Can I ask,
Cool.
so I'm gonna ask you a question about displacement.
Cool.
So can you tell me like how much ground troops are going to be reducing the refugee crisis?
Well, we're actually going to be solving for all of it because we tell you currently in the status quo, they're relying on the Iranian-backed militia forces.
Right.
And if we go in, they won't have to do that.
Wait, they
Furthermore-
won't have to rely on them? Just because they won't rely on them, does that
And
mean there's
also-
all the Iranian militias are going to lay down their arms?
No, they're just going to leave. Now,
They're just going to leave?
furthermore-
Wait, why
Can I
would they
finish?
just leave?
William, can I please finish?
Sure.
Okay, that's the second half. The first half is we need United States ground troops to retake back the cities. That's what the McClatchy Washington
Okay, so
Bureau
they're going
and
like door to,
advisor-
wait, so what do they do in the cities?
They retake the cities
What does that
and
mean?
allow. Please let me finish,
Sure.
William. We retake the cities and allow the refugees to return. It's quite simple.
Okay,
Now, can I
so
ask you a
wait,
question?
they're going door to door in cities?
That's not what retaking cities mean.
Then what does
Can I ask you
retaking
a
cities mean?
It means removing ISIL from the cities and retaking
If
it.
they're
just
in
like we
houses,
did in
they're
Iraq
going door to
last
door,
time.
which becomes uniquely problematic when 9 in 10 Iraqis view force against the U.S. as a legitimate form of
Really?
resistance.
Then why do they want us there?
They don't.
We'll be taking some brief prep time, please. Give it the cards. What? All the cards are back.
ISIS is they say they're just Taliban forces. CBS says they're just Taliban forces that are rebranding themselves. They're not Taliban forces. Second, and here from third, ISIS there actually isn't any ISIS in Afghanistan. Third, the Afghan army system of war that's sufficient to overcome. Fourth, China, Pakistan, the Taliban are all opposed to the U.S. news.
Okay, I have another 30 seconds used then. Do you have something different?
No, that's fine.
Okay, cool. Oh, like. Okay, you two ready? Mm-hmm. Will ready? Okay. Before I get to the specifics of my opponent's cases, one overall observation, which is that they give you no reason why we need to be the ones combating ISIL. Because according to Liz Sly of the Washington Post, ISIS is collapsing in the status quo. As a result, current efforts are going to be successful enough to defeat ISIL. There's no reason why we need to commit ground troops. Now going to the first observation on how ISIS is a threat. They give you a lot of news reports from like Hagel, Newsweek, all these people saying ISIS is a threat. The reason why these news reports say ISIS is a threat is because they're sensationalists and saying ISIS wants to kill you is a very effective way to get new readers. That's not an objective assessment. An objective assessment, according to U.S. intelligence officials, says ISIS poses no imminent threat to the United States. In fact, this is bared out by statistical research, which finds that there's only, according to the Washington Post, a 1 in 20 million chance that of a terrorist attack occurring. As a result, we're going to be valuing American lives first, because that has a 100% chance of occurring, rather than a 1 in 20 million chance of being killed by a terrorist attack. Then they give you this analysis saying there's going to be a nuclear threat. But they never tell where are they going to be getting these nuclear materials. There are no nuclear materials in Iraq. However, according to Dr. Mueller of Ohio State University, there's only a 1 in 3 billion chance of a nuclear terrorist attack. As a result, we're not going to be seeing the probability be very big. Then they go on to their second observation, which say only one example is enough. But to the point where we're going to be seeing probability times magnitude equals the size of your impact, if they don't prove that it is likely that we're going to be deploying the troops in that area, they aren't going to have big enough probability, and no matter how big the magnitude, it's not going to be enough for you to affirm. Now going to contention 1, which talks about decapitation. The first problem with this is that decapitation is actually going to be counterproductive. Jenna Jordan of Georgia Tech explains that when you decapitate the leader, the next people in command feel that they need to prove themselves. As a result, they're more deadly, and as a result, you see more attacks when you lead to decapitation and take out the leaders. But second, and more importantly, when we look at ISIL-specific evidence, we actually see it's going to be counterproductive even more so. Jessica Stern of Harvard University explains in her book ISIS Inside the State of Terror that ISIS is specifically designed to withstand the death or removal of their top leader. This is proof by the fact that when last March we took out al-Baghdadi and we didn't even notice for an entire month. That's how little change it results. Then going to the next contention, which talks about displacement. The first big problem with this is it assumes that they're going to be having a complete solvency. That's where they reduce this displacement problem. But to the point where all their solvency evidence assumes that we're just going to be combating ISIL rather than this ISIL plus these Shia militias, means that they aren't going to be getting any of their solvency. But the second big problem is that they give you no quantification as to how much you're going to be having this refugee problem. They say that the refugees is a very arduous process because Iran has control in the area. Iran will have control in the area even if you vote affirmative. As a result, this arduous process, what they say is the main barrier, is still going to be existing. Then they say that we're going to be reclaiming the cities. But that, as Will points out in Crossfire, that's going to require going door to door, to the point where that's going to be seen as an occupation by the citizens of Iraq that triggers all the harms of occupation that we delineate in case. But then they say that we're going to be removing the power of these Iranian militias. They give you exactly 0 card for this effect. The reason why that's important is because even if the United States goes in, they're not going to be displacing the militias. The militias are just going to be attacking them. They're not going to be laying down their arms. Now going to the next contention, which talks about Afghanistan. There's a ton of problems with this. The first one is that it's not topical, which is when the point where we're looking in the rounds that they themselves tell you we already have troops in Afghanistan. As a result, then we're not going to be committing new troops like the resolution specifies. It's not going to be topical. The second big problem with this is even if it is topical, to the point where its magnitude times probability equals the size of your impact, to the point where there's a very, very low probability of us re-invading Afghanistan, means that the probability is going to be so minor that you shouldn't be looking to this. The third big problem with this is that even if they tell you we're going to be using current troops and you believe that's topical, to the point where those current troops are currently fighting the Taliban, and now they have to fight ISIL, means you're going to trade off with a much worse terrorist group, which is going to be a big problem in the end of the round. The next big problem comes from CBS News, who explains that most of these people who are currently who say they're part of ISIL aren't actually significant threats. They're just disaffected people who are formerly members of the Taliban, so we aren't seeing an increase in terrorism, and they're just waving an ISIS flag so that they seem more legit. That's not actually going to be a net threat to the United States. Then that's why Katia of veterans today actually finds that there's no actual ISIL threat in Afghanistan. But then you can look to the Afghan army, who explains that when the Afghan army is more than enough to combat the minor threat that ISIS actually is in Afghanistan, if they even do exist. And for all these reasons, we urge you to negate. Thank you.
So for the brief off-time roadmap, I'm doing one overview on the entire case, and that comes from an extension from observation 1, and a little bit of an extension from contention 3, and then one new card. And that's an overview on the entire case, and then I'm going right down. So is everyone ready?
Yeah.
Sam Coles dropped the Senate for Armed Service Committee card in our observation 1, and you extend it right now, and show an extended summary, and I'm going to extend it in final focus. Don't let them respond to it. What that tells you is even if you believe that ISIL is not a threat in the status quo, they will only grow as a threat. And then you combine this with the Brookings Institute. The Brookings Institute does polls, and what they found is public support for ground troops is increasing. It's been increasing in the past month, and it's at 2/3 right now. Brookings specifically tells you with the new election coming up, you'll see politicians forced to send in ground troops in the future. So here's the turn on the case, buy their whole case and believe it's bad to send in ground troops. But if you sign your ballot neg, in a year when we're at the TOC next year, everybody in the room, the public support, is going to force you to send in ground troops. But when you send in ground troops according to the Senate Armed Service Committee, it's going to be more of a threat. So you send in more troops, cost more money, and that exacerbates all their impacts. Let's bite the bullet now and take their impacts but make them smaller. But now let's go specific to their contentions. On the contention one, first I'll point about feed propaganda. The RAND Corporation tells you that ISIL is an insurgent group, not a terrorist group. So they operate completely differently. And the way to beat them and beat their propaganda is to take their land back, specifically with ground combat troops. That's why, secondly, Boot of Foreign Affairs tells you that the way to take out the message of a caliphate is to beat them. They can't be telling people, oh, join us in increasing recruitment when they're getting their butts kicked. That's why when we take their land, we take away from the religious message. But thirdly, on feed propaganda, remember what Sam Coles drops in Afghanistan. Show tells you that Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, says ISIL quotes the Quran as Afghanistan having significant influence in their caliphate. We take out Afghanistan, that's the linchpin of their propaganda. But now let's go secondly of shifting tactics. There are three turns here. First of all, the Cockburn evidence concedes that it works. Intervention would work and then put them on the defensive. That's why they have to start killing. But secondly, this hurts their recruitment. You can turn the Cockburn here, and I'm going to do it later in the contention too, when he says Cockburn says they need recruitment. If they're killing their people, then they're not going to be doing increasing recruitment. But the third turn we put in is the SQUO is causing this right now. In the status quo, we're doing airstrikes, and that's causing them to kill people. Or if we were to do other forms of military aid and defeat ISIL like they're saying the status quo is doing, then that causes more civilian casualties. But Walden tells you is that when you send in troops, that decreases civilian casualties by 75% because you increase policing. That's what we did in the Iraq War. So if they care about the civilians, send in the troops to protect them, because according to them, ISIL is going to be defeated either way. But now let's go on to the third thing about the violence of targets. Remember, you turn Neumeier, because Neumeier says in the status quo, we're sending other types of military aid. And that military aid, he says, increases more anti-American sentiment. So there's a trade-off. If we send in ground troops, we're not going to be funding militias, or we're not going to be doing as much airstrikes, which he finds causes less anti-American sentiment. Neumeier concedes that ground troops are the best option. But now let's go to contention 2 of legitimacy. First of all, this is not going to be like the last Iraq War. We're not taking out the government. We're not getting rid of the entire army. We're supporting a democratically elected government versus an insurgent group. That's why they specifically want us there. But on the second warning, they tell you with the Maoists. Remember, you can respond with Zini on their idea of multilateral. Zini tells you, General Zini tells you, that if we're so concerned about multilateral efforts, the U.S. can send in a few small battalions, and that would catalyze a multilateral coalition, boots on the ground, because they're just waiting for us to spearhead the effort. But now let's talk about the militia backlash. The first turn is this concedes displacement. They talk about how these Shiite militias are very bad. That's why we need to go in, because they're displacing people and not allowing people to return to the cities. But secondly, Al Jazeera tells you their Mahdi army estimate of 500,000 is way overblown. It's really only 10,000. They can feed in case. But here's the biggest turn, and this turns this entire contention. Show brings up in first crossfire, Ayatollah Sistani, from 1 month ago, told the Shiite groups that weren't cooperating with us, hey, get your act together, we have a common enemy of ISIL. And Ayatollah Sistani runs all of the Shiites, and that's what happened in the last Iraq War. He told them to disband their army, and he listened. Ayatollah Sistani wants to work with us, it makes sense. We have a common enemy of ISIL. So turn all of their Shiite militias, buy the 500,000. That's 500,000 people we work with to stop this problem once and for all, and that is why I urge a strong pro-ballot. Thank you.
Can you show us the part in Coburn that concedes your side?
No, I do like a cross-application.
Okay.
But you said it was in Coburn. You said Coburn.
If you want to talk about in crossfire.
Okay, also, can I see 75%?
Sure.
There we go, thanks.
Sure, 75%. Oh, yeah. Do you want to start cross, Sam? Or?
Yeah, so I'll
Let's
go
get
to
it.
me.
Yeah, you can just give it to Will.
Yeah,
it's
sure.
not-
I'm gonna
You're
get right
the
next
same
to
person,
you.
it's all good.
Cool. All right, judges ready?
You are? Okay. Do you mind if I ask you about something you brought up in real beginning of your rebuttal?
Sure.
You said from Brand that we're going to have to be taking back land is how you stop an insurgency.
Okay, well, what it tells you is there's...
No, that's just so we're on the same page. That was a
Okay, yeah, now can I ask you a question?
No.
Okay.
So- Just going to keep going. So basically, when take back land, when ISIS currently controls land, right, like something about a third of Iraq, when we, assuming your side is correct, who will control the land after the U.S. wins?
Okay, what we tell you is, because you guys want to look at Iraq parallels, we'll look at the last Iraq War. How many days did it take us to recapture major cities in 2003?
Well, see, I think
It
on
was
May.
21 days.
Yeah,
It
that's
was
when the
21
mission
days.
accomplished went off with the big,
But
yeah,
look,
Abraham Lincoln.
you guys
and then we had
advocate-
another 7 years of disaster.
Exactly, but you advocate for Iraq troops are able to do this. So we can go in, recapture cities. Remember, our only advocacy with recapturing the cities is getting those people back in. We're in there 21
really
days,
wasn't
we
at all
concede
my
right through
question.
contention too.
This wasn't my question.
What was your question? 'Cause it
My
didn't
question
sound
is,
like a question.
who's going to retake the land after the United States leaves?
We tell you, we can transition in the hands of the Iraqi government, which is democratically elected, has legitimacy.
So your long-term sovereignty is contingent on the continuous efficacy of the Iraqi army?
No, that's not true. We never read in our case like defeating ISIL through land gains. We read in our contention
You read
to
your rebuttal.
getting people back into
Great.
cities, and that's how we're going to do it. No, the Rand card was
Yes.
taking out their legitimacy and caliphate. It also talks
By
about the
taking back
religious
land.
message where ISIL is quoting the Quran as saying the final fighting force for our Muslim caliphate will come from Afghanistan. So we stopped them there. That's the linchpin of
Did
the
you
whole
or did you
operation.
not say
Now
they
can I
have
ask
to
you a
take
question?
back land?
I said that was one of the ways to defeat
Okay,
the
you want
caliphate.
to ask me a question?
Yeah, now I want to ask you a question, okay? So you respond to our contention with like all of these threat cards. What is like the most recent date saying there's no threat? Like the U.S. Intel, Washington Post, Mueller is from 2009.
Yep.
Like, what's your most recent card?
I could provide the dates if you
Okay,
like them.
because like the U.S. Intel, that's post-dated. You dropped Chuck Hagel, who I don't think he's
No, I
biased.
didn't.
He's the Secretary of Defense. Your only response to Chuck
None.
Hagel is he's trying to sensationalize to get more people to read his newspaper. He
No.
doesn't have a newspaper.
I
So
know
what Chuck
what-
Hagel tells you is ISIL is a unique threat. So when you read me Mueller from 2009, cool. ISIL is something we've never seen before. That's specifically what Chuck Hagel has. And if you don't think there's a WMD threat, because you really only respond to nuclear, the Harvard card I handed to
speech.
the Harvard card I handed to Will was about all types of WMDs. So what's your response to 1 week ago when in Kansas there was an attack on a military base with a WMD from an ISIL operative?
Are you over? Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
You can answer now.
So, the lone, that was in Kansas, it was a lone wolf attack, correct? There was implications of a lone wolf attack?
Exactly.
So, the thing about lone wolf attacks is that if you take out the organization, they still exist.
Oh, awesome.
Definition of lone wolf is that they aren't tied to the
Sam,
organization.
Sam, what the FBI card that we read in case that you also dropped that said the FBI doesn't have capabilities to stop lone wolf attacks says these lone
Stop
wolves
this
within
one.
the United States are it says in the future the lone wolves are radicalized by ISIL, so we need to take out their propaganda.
He goes in secretary. That's for a year. I'm gonna take prep.
Okay.
Two of these.
That was another 40 seconds used.
Cool.
You had 43 left.
Okay.
We have no.
Yes.
We have run no.
You're at 2 minutes left.
I addressed a lot of these like overviews in the time post on the web, and then go down to my own issues. We actually definitely responded to the Senate Arms Service Committee talking about increase in threat. Because while theirs is a political thing, Sly reports that ISIS is collapsing in the status quo. That is literally the direct opposite of a rising threat. That means they are collapsing in the long term, they get rid of it. That also takes out this bite the silver bullet idea about growing public support, because when it collapses within a year, there's no impetus to intervene because they're already gone. They talk about in this overview to our case that they say from Rand that this is an insurgency, not a terrorism. That's huge. Insurgencies don't attack the United States. Insurgencies are based inside the States. All their stuff about terrorism attacking the U.S. does not apply if they're an insurgency. That's pretty critical. When they talk about Hagel, Hagel hasn't been defense secretary for a year. It's not perfectly good evidence. First reason to vote for us is going to be on legitimacy. They talk about going door to door. That means going and interacting with large numbers of troops into the areas. And what Rand says, and they cold drop, is that 9 in 10 Iraqi Sunnis believe attacking the United States is a legitimate form of resistance. And that means their view is an occupation, which Pape says leads to a 95% increase in suicide attacks, and Lyle says decreases the efficacy by 59%. Let's compare the threats. Mazzetti tells you that ISIS itself poses no imminent threat to the United States. The real threat comes when they start attacking American soldiers, which only occurs if you intervene and are perceived as an occupation. Second, let's discuss this idea of backlash. They talk about this decrease by 75%, but that's literally never talking about combat troops. Don't buy this. We tell you from powers that they're currently in insurgency, so they won't attack the US, but when you attack them, there's a 20.6% increase in terrorism. You turn them into a terrorist organization, you turn it into an American problem when you intervene. Let's discuss this idea of Afghanistan. 1, it's not topical because there are not more troops. Second, from CBS we tell you they're not actually new ISIL threats, they're just Taliban rebranded. 3, the Afghan army says they can handle it. And 4, Veterans Today says effectively there is no ISIL threat in Afghanistan. They're not enumerating it, they're not telling you the size. It's not worth sending the 10,000 troops and risking their lives in order for a non-existent threat. And for all these reasons, we are very proud to negate.
Hey, Will, can you show us where in the Waldman it says it's not ground combat troops?
That was what he showed.
Yeah, I know. Okay, we're gonna pull it out. Can you show me where?
Whenever you highlight it is exactly where.
I didn't highlight anything.
Well, that's a problem.
Right there. Okay, let's just talk about the police.
Yeah, now we're gonna. So 15 seconds left.
Alright, so it's going to be briefly about turns, observation 1, and its relevance in contention 223. Sound good? So, are my judges ready? My opponents? Arvin. Don't forget the turn that my Arvin puts on their final contention. He tells you that the Ayatollah even says that they back United States. Right there, it's game over because it shows that they're going to support the United States when they go on. Furthermore, don't forget Arvin's turn that says it decreases the conflict by 75%. My opponents talk about how it's not about ground troops, but it is. It says that when ground troops go in, they act like a policing force. Now move on to our contention, observation 1. We talk about how it's a threat. My opponents come up here and try to tell you that it's not, but 2 days ago, the FBI and the TSA even confirmed that they're a threat. Also, they want to ignore Chuck Hagel for some reason, but he is our Secretary of Defense, and he says that there's something we've never seen before. Right now, there, it's game over. My opponents want to come up here and try to talk about how nuclear terror isn't a big deal, but the Harvard says that it's also chemical weapons and biological weapons. Furthermore, Al-Qaeda didn't even need a weapons of mass destruction, and they were able to commit 9/11. Clearly, it shows that they're a huge threat and it's a problem. Furthermore, don't forget that we need to bite the bullet. The Senate Armed Services Committee specifically says that if we don't stop them now, we'll have to go in the future because of political pressure. Right there, it's game over. And the FBI says that we need to defeat their ideology. My opponents come here and try to give you the sly card, how they're being defeated in the status quo, but let's give them the silver bullet. This is specifically about Iraq, and if they get into Afghanistan, this will just increase and become a bigger problem in the future, and we'll have to go in later. So right there, we need to intervene, now or later. Turn my opponent's entire case. Now moving on to contention 2. My opponents come up here and try to tell you that we're not going to be able to show solvency, but we specifically tell you that we are. The last time we were able to capture all Iraq cities in 21 days. We'll be able to do the same exact thing. My opponents come up here and try to tell you that 9 out of 10 Iraq's opposed thing, but that's specifically about permanent occupation. We'll only be there for 21 days, and as a result, we'll reduce terrorism by 3,600%. That's the Journal of International Affairs, coupled with Reuters' 200% increase in refugee population. That's the biggest impact in today's round. We're reducing the amount of refugees. Furthermore, let's go into Afghanistan. It's relevant in today's round because they recommit the ground combat troops to become, to combat the ISIS. My opponents come up here and try to talk about the Taliban, but they are about to be withdrawn. So they were just recommitted. Furthermore, we're stopping them from getting $50 billion, and we're stopping their ideology of their final war against Afghanistan. Extends Institute a study of war which specifically says that we will need U.S. support. And for all these reasons, I urge a strong pro-ballot. Thank you.
Can we see $50 billion?
50? Yeah, sure.
Okay. You can pull that there across.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
So you say during the Iraq War it took us 21 days to capture the cities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How long were we there after that?
Yeah.
So we're there for another, 9 years?
Yeah, so you can capture it in 21 days, and then you spend the next 9 years trying to hold it.
Yeah.
And
Wait,
all
what
the
were you
gains
doing
are
in those
erased.
next 9 years?
Failing.
Yeah, good one.
Really?
The thing we tell you is like
Yeah.
we're not advocating for that. Our advocacy and contention to like taking back territories is like taking back the territories, putting the displaced people back in. Then ISIL goes on the run. But look, we didn't take out the government. We didn't take out the
no,
army.
that's
We have
not
people
my
to work
point.
with. Then like
That's
we
not
give
my
you
point. No,
special
my point-
operations.
no,
and
no,
we can
no.
stop them from Afghanistan.
okay.
Like you're
This is
mischaracterizing.
another
What was
speech.
CPA order number 1 and CPA order number 2 in Iraq
What's
War?
CPA?
Coalition Provisional Authority.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's debathification.
Okay, cool. What did that do?
L. Pearl Bremer says that like the Saddam, ex-Saddam Ba'athist people are
Exactly,
not
the
allowed to
Ba'athist
get
Party.
pensions.
They weren't allowed to get pensions?
Yeah, that's actually part of it.
Yeah, it also kicked them out of the government.
Yeah, that's,
So
that's
like
part
we
of
took out
pensions.
70% of their government. Then we also took out their military.
Yeah.
So then we had
Okay,
we
I
had
know
the
the history
nation.
lesson.
Okay.
So we
That's
had the
not the
nation
point.
built.
Is that what
That's
we're doing
not what
this
we're
time?
doing this time.
Are we doing that this
There are
time?
obviously differences between the original and
Exactly.
but wait, there are some parallels. For example,
Okay,
taking
exactly.
The parallels are we
21
can do it
days
in
to take
21
back
days
the
No.
to
city.
take back cities.
Yeah, and then the continual
That's the
parallel
parallel.
is that you take it back in 21 days and then it gets reclaimed by ISIL or another group.
Except
that the
here's not, except
They
we
can't
have-
hold the cities is
Guys,
the parallel.
we have, except last time it was just us trying to hold the cities. We have the entire Iraqi army, and then
Okay,
we
well,
have
whoa.
the, hold on,
Didn't
Will,
you say earlier that the Iraqi army is insufficient
Will,
and
we
really
also
weak?
have-
You
we
said that in
also-
your case.
we also have the 500,000 Shia militias
No,
you're trying to sweep under the
no.
rug,
Okay.
which Sistani told the
I
world.
I'm glad you brought that
specifically
up.
says we have to
Yeah,
work with
because
them.
I know you're going to try to respond to it in Final Focus. You dropped a summary. I'm going for it in Final Focus.
Okay.
We have
Okay.
500 people willing to work with us on the ground once we
Okay.
take those cities back.
Can we
That
make it
sounds
work?
pretty good to me.
Okay. Aren't you the one in case in your contention 2 saying how these Shia militias are terrible for Iraq?
So if they're working with us, that's
Look,
not
it's like a
good
simple
thing.
double bind. We tell you either
You're the
status
double
quo
bind.
isn't. Okay, look, it's the bite the bullet versus the silver bullet. Here's how
What?
we simply explain to you, okay? If the judges believe status quo isn't solving, that means ISIL's a threat, and we need to bite the bullet now with Senate Armed Service Committee and Brookings,
Well,
so we don't
no,
have
it's
to
true.
solve
Wait,
it
even
later.
if you buy it's a threat and you think the ground force make it worse, you vote neg.
No, but like
No.
we're giving you like the unique sovereignty. But look, that's the bite the bullet. But then the silver bullet is if the judges believe they're declining in the status quo, you only read evidence about them declining in Iraq. That explains.
And then we tell you that they're useless in
Here's
Afghanistan.
why they're not
no way
declining.
to
Here's why they're not
Afghanistan.
declining in
Drop veterans in it.
Afghanistan.
Yeah,
You're
you
starting
really-
at 0. You can't get any lower.
What? That's like
That's why they're not
+1.
declining.
You read me veterans today. The Pentagon confirmed they're in Afghanistan.
Okay,
They're in the Zabul
okay, we
province.
read you
They're in the
CPS saying
Helmand
the
province.
ISIL in Afghanistan is just disgruntled Taliban people numbering very small.
I mean, the
Afghanistan
Pentagon
army says
government-
they are
okay, look,
more than
they're
sufficient.
not
That
large.
really
It's
doesn't
not-
make sense.
it
or
also
else the
matters how
Pentagon
big the
wouldn't
numbers
have
are.
recommitted the troops.
They
That's why
haven't.
we
Also,
need to
recommitting
They
troops takes
did.
away from fighting Taliban.
All right.
You said we have 43 seconds remaining.
That's right.
We will be taking that. Thank you.
They dropped this out. Insurgencies power cells will attack. They turn into a terrorist.
You guys ready? Guys ready? Okay. let's first talk about this idea of whether or not ISIS is a threat to the United States. They reviewed this evidence, all this from like Chuck Hagel, our current defense secretary, even though he hasn't been there for a year, is saying that they're currently a threat. However, when you actually look at it, these are because the sensationalist news reports are blowing up big claims saying that we are a threat, when in reality we're currently able to handle this. When you actually look at the statistical data, Plumer says only 1 in 20 million Americans are killed by a terrorist threat. As a result, this isn't going to be a very big impact in today's round. However, what's really important comes from their own concession in their rebuttal from Rand, who says that ISIS is an insurgency. Insurgencies do not attack the United States because they just want gains in Iraq. The reason why that's really important is because they will attack the United States if we intervene. This is the powers analysis at the bottom of our first contention, which they entirely dropped. It says that when you intervene, you see a 20.6% increase in terrorism. Even though that's from a small baseline, if you are looking at terrorism like they want you, then we are going to be seeing this increase. Then on Lyle, which they also dropped, tells you there's a 59% increase in the decrease in the likelihood of success when you're perceived as an occupation. To the point where they themselves concede we're going door to door, that's going to be an occupation. We still trigger all these suicide attack harms. The second and most important reason why you're going to want to negate is off of the current efforts right now. They acknowledge this lie analysis, but never actually refute the idea that they are collapsing in the status quo, and because current efforts are succeeding. This is coming out of the third warrant in our second contention, who says that what happens when you send ground troops is there other forces are going to be pulling out. Our current efforts are going to be undermined. They say other forces are going to be coming in if we also enter. But as Will points out in the summary, that's not true because they learned the lesson from the Iraq War. They're not going to be doing it again. But the most important thing to remember on this voting issue is the fact that in summary, they tell you their solvency comes from the fact that we defeated Al-Qaeda in 21 days in Iraq. However, the reason why it's really important is because we did not succeed in Iraq. Their entire solvency comes from the Iraq War, which was a dead failure. The reason why this really, now let's go into this issue of Afghanistan. Now remember that there aren't in Afghanistan the status quo, and these are rebranded Taliban members who the Afghan army can handle already. At the end of the day, what's really important to remember is that while ISIS is collapsing the status quo and isn't a threat to the United States, because the ground troops just undermine those very successful efforts, we urge you to negate. Thank you.
Alright, we'll run our remaining 30 seconds.
We got 12.
Oh, 12?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's about it.
Okay, so I'm going the threat and bite the bullet. Then I'm going Afghanistan silver bullet. And then I'm going to displacement. So does that work with everybody? Start with the threat of ISIS. We've given you the clear intention and clear capabilities. Our opponents repeatedly say that it's not going to be a new terror threat. But what Hagel tells you is they're a threat we've never seen in the past. Show extend that in summary. They don't respond to the fact that there was an attack in Kansas. And when Show extended the FBI evidence from yesterday, which says we're not going to be able to stop this going into the future, specifically from those sleeper agents. But remember, those sleeper agents are indoctrinated by ISIL. But when we stop their propaganda, which is going to be important in Afghanistan, and when we stop their ideology of creating a caliphate, we secure ourselves. This is a threat I'm not willing to take their threat calculus. Even if the probability is low, the magnitude is huge of a WMD attack like was attempted in Kansas. But that's why the Senate Armed Services Committee tells you that if you believe they're a threat and they're not declining the status quo, combined with the Brookings, then what I keep extending is that tells you that we're going to have to bite the bullet now unless you see their harms larger. But that comes to the silver bullet, which is my second voter, which is the idea that if you think they're declining the status quo, that's why they're going to Afghanistan. Even if it's one person right now, we give you they're getting the $1 billion, could expand the $50 billion. That's the evidence in Afghanistan. That's why they established the caliphate in Afghanistan once they have the ideology behind it. So let's do the silver bullet, finish off Afghanistan once and for all. They give you no other solvency how we can stop them and stop their funding and stop this organization. But now let's lastly go to the idea of cities. Remember, we're decreasing terrorism hugely by replacing these people. Here's our advocacy. It's not a foreign occupation. You turn the Lyles and you turn the powers evidence because we're not advocating for a foreign occupation. We're not taking out the government, we're not taking out the military, and we're not having to rebuild from scratch. But then you also combine that with the fact that we can work with the Iraqi government once we take back the cities after 21 days, if you want to look to the Iraq comparison, and also the cold drop turns on their 500,000 Shiite militias who are willing to work with us and not fight against us. We have the common enemy. Remember the impact we have. If we put every 1% of people we put back in, decreases terrorism attacks by 18%. That is your #1 voter because we're protecting the United States even if it's not ISIL. We save the United States. Thank you.